Julia's apron was still damp from the rain when the cup slipped from her fingers and spread a dark, hot stain across the counter. The sound, ceramic against formica, the small clatter of sugar packets scattering, seemed to drag every eye in Tony's diner toward her. For a second, the kitchen shrank to the size of the tile beneath her boots. The brick wall behind the grill, cold and merciless, the neon sign outside buzzing through a fine mist, the steady hiss of the fryer, suddenly too loud. Her hands trembled as she reached for a towel. If you love uplifting, real-life-inspired stories, stick around, like, and subscribe. She learned the diner's rhythms early, how to time a pour so the foam settled like a promise, how to remember a regular's order and slip it across the counter before they asked. She had learned dignity in the small calibrations of work, the precise way to fold a napkin, the kind of question that made a tired customer smile. That morning, with Michael's school shoes still damp in the back seat of their beat-up minivan, dignity felt thin as tissue. Frank, who came in most days after the second bell for the morning rush, watched the coffee spill and smiled in that way people smile when they know they have the power to be cruel. He liked to make people small. He wore his contempt like a suit tailored to fit the room, an effortless privilege that camouflaged a lifetime of being allowed to dominate. "Careful, Julia," he said, loud enough that the booth nearest the door heard. Heads turned, someone chuckled. The laughter was small and ordinary, but to Julia it felt like a breeze sharpening into wind. She bowed her head and cleaned. Her fingers worked automatically. Towel, towel, wipe, breathe. She kept the conversation light with a woman in the corner, handed over a scrambled egg special with the practiced calm of someone who'd learned to hold storms in her palms. But the color had drained from the world. Coffee tasted metallic in her mouth. Tony stood by the grill, spatula in hand, the diner's history written in the lines around his eyes. He'd owned the place for decades. He'd loved its stubbornness, its stubborn staff. He watched Frank and the customers as if cataloging the shapes they made against the light. Tony's hands were steady, his loyalty was steady. He had been there the day Julia walked in for the first time, with a resume in her pocket and a hope so careful it could have been folded and stored. Julia thought of Michael, of a note taped to the fridge, permission slip signed, one field trip to the museum, of overdue envelopes tucked behind the cereal box, of the way her son had asked, 2 nights before, whether she would ever stop working nights. She thought of the small, fierce gravity that made her keep going. Some nights she slept, knowing she had done what she could. Other nights, fear crept in like damp cold through a cracked window. Frank's voice cut through another small silence. "You sure you're not looking for something easier? Hobnobbing with customers is a skill, right? Not everyone's cut out for the grind." "You don't know what you're talking about," Julia said quietly, because the kitchen taught her to answer without making a scene. But Frank was patient with his cruelty. He could draw it out, wear it like armor until someone flinched. David sat at the counter, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He'd been coming in for weeks, always at different hours, always taking the stool by the window. He watched the town the way some people watch old films, attentive to the small gestures, the ways faces softened at certain jokes, the moments a regular's troubles showed through a steady line of behavior. He took in the spill without looking away. Where others saw an accident, he saw the shape of a life strained thin. He was not what the word boss usually summoned to mind. He wore no gold, no loud watches. When he spoke, his voice had the slow precision of someone who had learned how to weigh words against consequences. He carried a wallet-sized photograph in the back of his mind, faces and places that had taught him empathy. He had built a company that made tidy returns, and, in quieter reports, a series of community investments. To the world, he was a philanthropist with a business mind. To himself, he carried a ledger of costs that no accountant had ever been asked to balance. Favors owed and favors taken, names scavenged from memory, promises that smelled faintly of smoke. Julia didn't know any of that. All she saw that morning was another customer, another glance, another miscalculation that could cost a shift. Her pulse was the only thing loud in her ears until the man at the counter stood up. "Enough," David said, not as a shout, but as a sudden room rearrangement. His voice carried, Firm without being theatrical, the way a good director calls cut and the noise stops because it's time for truth. He set his cup down and placed a few bills where anyone could see them, then walked toward the spill with the ease of someone who deliberately took small risks. Tony edged forward, hands on hips, ready to intervene. Frank turned his head, annoyed at the interruption. The diner watched as if anticipating a novelty. David reached across the counter and took the towel from Julia's hand. "Let me," he said. His fingers were large and sure. He wiped the spill with no patronizing air and passed the towel back. There was no applause, only an inhalation and the soft resettling of conversation. "Thanks," Julia said, voice thin and astonished. She wanted to pull away, wanted to protect herself from the pity she feared, but his eyes were steady. They were the kind of eyes that invited trust without demanding surrender. After the rush, when cluttered plates had been cleared and the fryers hummed like contented insects, David asked if she could take a break in the back alley. He said it casually, like a man who asked ordinary favors. Julia hesitated. She was careful with chances now. But the alley offered a sliver of privacy next to the hulking brick wall, damp and raw from the night's downpour. The wall was the color of old promises. She leaned her palm against it and felt its cold. "You handled that well," Tony said from the doorway, more an observation than praise. He plugged a towel into his apron and went back to the stove. Frank muttered something under his breath and left, codified indignation radiating. The moment snapped a little. The kitchen resumed its modest rituals. David sat on the low step beside the dumpster, removing the collar of his jacket. He had been watching for someone like Julia for some time, someone who treated work as not just a transaction, but as a way of holding a community together. He'd noticed the way she knew the regulars, the way she covered shifts for others, the quiet patience that was not submissiveness, but muscle built of necessity. There was a ragged beauty to people who kept going when the odds were stacked. He had a program, he had resources. He also carried a past he had kept carefully folded. After a minute of silence, he said, "I run a small investment firm. We look for local businesses that could do more than survive, ones that could sustain families and make town life better. I don't mean handouts. I mean partnership, capital, training, improvements. I come in looking for places I can help, and I've been circling this diner for a few weeks." Julia sat with this like a strange coin in her mouth. The word investment felt like a private language she hadn't learned. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was not incredulous so much as defensive. She kept thinking of tax forms and paperwork she didn't have time to sign. David smiled. It felt small and human. "Because I remember being young and invisible. Because my first job taught me the worth of someone who shows up. Because I want my company to do more than make numbers. We help places commit to paying people a living wage, to create training, to offer scheduling that doesn't shred a life. We fund staff education funds, we install safety nets, and we help owners like Tony find ways to modernize without erasing what people love." Julia thought of the minivan, the note on the fridge, the permission slip. She thought of pride, how easy it had been to confuse pride with stubbornness. She asked the practical questions. "Do you mean wages? Benefits?" "Yes," David said, "and mentorship for staff, a board that includes employees, and a small revolving fund for emergencies. We start small, we learn, we hold owners' hands when systems change. But it works when we do it with people who are already invested in their work and in their community." He folded his hands and looked at her as if he could see the ledger in her chest. She wanted to say no. She wanted to guard the dignity that had been eroded by 1,000 small humiliations. Yet his offer carried no sermon, only a mechanism, capital plus accountability. She found herself saying yes, a word that tasted like the unknown and the possible. After they returned to the diner, the afternoon moved in a slow, deliberate way. David paid his bill and left a business card with a discreet logo that meant little to Julia, until she saw the image of a town square on the back and a list of community grants that made her eyes widen. That night, Julia lay awake listening to the rain. For the first time in months, the thought that something might change did not feel like a betrayal of the effort she had already given. It felt like a possibility she had earned. A week passed, and with it, the shape of new routines. David came back, met with Tony, and the two men spoke in the small language of negotiations. It involved spreadsheets and steady promises, but most importantly, it involved listening. Tony feared losing the diner's soul. David promised to protect it while repairing the cracks that made people like Julia risk collapse. But there was a thing unsaid, a file kept behind a locked door in David's past. He was measured in his words about growth. He did not broadcast the ledger of his life. He had arrived at this work partly to rewrite his own account. He had built the firm from money that hadn't always arrived on glowing balance sheets. In quieter moments, he had given away a part of his name to better stories because the truth sounded monstrous when recited. He had been careful to remove the traces of that life from his new business identity. For his team to put together a case study of a diner might require a public face that could not include shadows. Julia, who was a pragmatist, accepted meetings and ideas. She worked a little differently, slightly more confidently, a shade less apologetic. When David suggested training sessions and a small committee that would include staff voices, she found herself volunteering. The first meeting was awkward and earnest, a circle of mismatched chairs, Tony in his grease-stained apron, Frank absent by choice, a teenage cook with dreams of going to culinary school, and a woman named Rosa who worked nights and had a laugh like a bell. They discussed schedules, safety improvements in the kitchen, small perks like paid sick days. The conversation was practical and human, and it stitched a fragile thread between lives. One slow afternoon, Julia found herself locking the door at closing and carrying the last stack of clean plates to the storeroom. The back room smelled of dish soap and old coffee. On a shelf, beneath a stack of faded menus, she found a thin packet of photocopied articles tied with twine, old community newsletters, program proposals, and a black-and-white photograph of a younger man with a crooked smile, surrounded by people who looked both elated and afraid. There, scrawled in ink, in a hand she didn't recognize, was a note. "For David, keep this safe. Do not let them know." Her fingers lingered on the photograph. Something in that composition pulled at a loose thread of recognition. She remembered the way David would sometimes pause when a certain song played on a radio, an invisible shudder in his posture, and how, when he thought no one was watching, his face would fold into a memory that tasted like regret. She had assumed it was business, the weight of debtors and deadlines. She hadn't imagined the contours of secrets. Curiosity is a quiet animal. It settles in the ribs and waits. Julia carried the photocopies home in her bag, the edges cold against her thigh. That night, she spread them on the kitchen table while Michael slept, his breath soft in the other room. The articles were clippings from a city paper decades old. The headlines spoke of underworld settlements and whispered deals. One article mentioned a name, one she recognized only after a moment of blurring focus. People's pasts looked different in small print than they did in the present. Names rearrange themselves until a person is no longer a person but a concept. Her first reaction was a slow rising caution. The town had an appetite for stories that fed itself with gossip. She thought of how Frank's cruelty might change with knowledge like this, how he would gloat with possession of the truth. She thought of Tony, who had trusted without asking many questions. She thought of what it meant to be chosen by someone who lived with shadows at the edge of his life. If David had a past, why had he not told them? If he had done harm, how could partnership bloom from that soil? The next day, she kept the photocopies in a drawer at the diner and moved around the kitchen like someone carrying a second skin. She watched David more closely. When he stepped in, he greeted the regulars with that same calm. He handed a 20 to a busker on the corner and chatted with a woman who tuned into the radio. He visited with the staff after hours, asking practical questions about ovens and supply chains. He never mentioned the photograph. He never offered an explanation. His silence pulled at the seams of their new agreement. Curiosity, once awake, asks for context. When she finally asked the question, it was not in a public place. They stood in the alley where the brick wall was beginning to warm in the late afternoon light. He had come to check on a delivery order and stayed for a moment, leaning against mortar that looked less like threat and more like history. "You asked me for my trust," Julia said. "You asked us to trust you with our jobs. I found these in the storeroom." She nodded toward his chest. It was a small-handed motion that meant more than the words. David's face did not shift into surprise. Instead, it seemed to settle into something like acceptance, a weathering. "I didn't want to burden the diner with my past," he said slowly. "There are things I've done that can't be washed away with a check. There are names and actions I wish I could undo." "How could you not tell us?" she demanded. The question had heat. She was not angry on behalf of the town. She was angry because secrecy felt like a theft of agency. "We're letting you into our lives." He met her eyes. "I've seen how quickly people will judge the messenger and not the message," he said. "I was afraid that if you knew who I used to be, you would see everything through that lens and not see what I'm trying to build now." "And what are you trying to build?" she asked, softer this time. She wanted to hear it in his own words, not in the gloss of a proposal deck. He talked then, but not as one might expect. He did not offer a sermon of redemption. He offered memory. He told her about a neighborhood in which he had once held sway, about how, as a younger man, he had believed that strength meant protecting people by controlling what came across their thresholds. He described reaching decisions in rooms that smelled of cheap cologne and coffee gone stale, decisions that cut both ways, protection that brought safety for some but shredded the lives of others. He described a particular winter, a child standing at a doorway with a shoebox and eyes like empty pockets. He described the moment he decided to stop answering the phone that connected him to that life. "I thought I was protecting people," he said. "I thought I could make things right by being a man who could push back and demand. But I discovered, slowly, that the cost was always people. I traded real freedom for what felt like safety and found I had built a cage for everyone I loved. The last thing I wanted to become was an excuse for more hurt." Julia's anger softened into a complicated pity. The photograph on her table, heavier in her hands than any bulk of paper, was no longer merely proof. It was an explanation that did not excuse. It posed a different kind of invitation: how to respond to a person whose hands had done harm and who now offered them in service. "You don't get to make up for everything," she said. "Not with money." "I don't expect to," he answered. "I don't think you should let me in because I'm penitent. I want to be held accountable to the people who will be affected by whatever we do here. That's why our model is structured. Community boards, staff representation, transparent audits. The money is only useful if it is tied to structures that prevent abuse. That's what accountability is, for me and for the company." She pictured auditing documents and committees in the same breath as kitchen upgrades and paid sick days. The two images felt oddly married, the prosaic and the intimate. She realized, with a small shock, that what she wanted more than excuses was a way to ensure that what happened in the past could not happen again. "Why the secrecy then?" she asked. He took a breath and looked past her, to the diner's neon sign, to the street where a child rode a bike in slow loops and a dog barked at nothing. "Because fear of being judged is a strong, ugly thing. Because I wanted the work to stand on its own. Because I thought I could outrun the past. I was wrong." She had imagined the worst, that knowing this would make him monstrous, that any good he offered was contaminated. Instead, she found a man who had carried the memory of harm like a stone in his backpack and now wanted to learn to lay it down. The recognition did not erase the past. It complicated what she felt. She felt wary and sympathetic at once, two truths living uneasily together. "And you? Do you want forgiveness?" she asked. That asked too much, perhaps. He did not ask for absolution. "I want to be useful," he said. "I want the work to count for people. I want to stop being part of the problem." She thought about Michael and the way his small hand had once curled around her finger when she walked him across a slippery parking lot. She thought about dignity as a daily practice. She thought about the way Tony had kept the diner alive as a stubborn human act. She thought about Frank, who would scorch at any sign of vulnerability. She thought about Frank, who would scorch at any sign of vulnerability. She thought about the teenage cook and Rosa and the Stas Education Fund someone had proposed in a meeting. Then be useful, she said finally, but openly. Let us anchor you with the structures you claim. No hidden agendas, no secret favors. He nodded. No secrets. They struck a practical arrangement. David's company would provide initial capital to increase wages and install better lighting in the dining room, because light mattered to morale in ways architecture could not name. They would fund a staff training program run by a local community college and start a small emergency fund for household crises, money no one had to explain away to pride. The agreement would include a community board with staff seats and the right for staff to vote on major changes. Julia walked back into the diner with the photocopies taped to the inside of a menu, not to hide, but to remind herself that truth had multiple uses. It could a burden or a tool. She felt both lighter and heavier. The decision to accept help was not a clean one. It was a complicated stitch between what had been and what might become. Word spread in slow, uneven waves. Some regulars shrugged. Some staff looked at Julia with that small, shocked curiosity reserved for people who cross lines without drama. Frank muttered and stayed away for a few days, then returned with a forced, cheery demeanor, as if opting out of a fight was the same as repentance. On the night the contract was signed, the diner stayed open late. Tony cooked an extra plate for the table at the back, the house special, an old recipe he kept like a secret. People lingered, eating food warmed by the presence of others. David sat at a corner table and watched without interrupting. He listened as Rosa, emboldened by the idea of paid sick days, spoke about saving for a class. The teenage cook, with a smear of flour on his cheek, talked about culinary scholarships he had never dared ask for before. Julia watched them and felt the stirrings of something both fragile and fierce. She thought about the photograph and the confession, about the small, careful structures they now had in place. Understanding did not mean absolution. It meant a willingness to see the causes as complicated, to insist on safeguards that kept people safe. A month later, the diner's lighting was warmer. Fluorescent harshness had softened into a honeyed glow that made faces look like home. The staff wore name tags with the community board's logo, and little cards at the cash register explained the pay raise initiative in plain language. Michael ate breakfast at a booth with an extra pancake on his plate, and his laugh, unburdened, filled the room like an announcement. It was in that new light that Julia finally allowed herself to imagine a future where dignity was not a fragile thing she carried alone. She still held to a caution that was practical, a skepticism that protected the town from quick decisions. But where before she had recoiled at the weight of secrets, she now recognized the possibility of transformation when structures matched intention. Yet the photograph and the old clippings had planted a question that would not settle. What does it mean to trust someone whose hands had once been complicit in harm? Trust, she decided, could be built, a slow work of small agreements and transparent actions. The first bricks had been laid: wages, training, governance. The harder work, the cultural shift, would take longer. She discovered, in time, that knowing the shape of a person's past could widen empathy rather than close it. David's confession did not erase his faults, but it illuminated a path he now chose to follow, one that refused to replicate old patterns and instead invested in preventing them. Seeing his pain, its origins, and its consequences allowed her to hold a more complicated truth. People can carry ugly histories and still choose to construct good futures if they are held accountable and if the community insists on safety. When Michael asked, months later, why they had let a stranger help, she told him the truth in the way that mattered. Because some people want to fix what they broke, and some want to build something better than what they had before. We watch, we learn, and we make sure everyone gets a say. The diner became a little brighter, the kitchen ran smoother, The staff began to plan for a day after a crisis, not during it. And in the evenings, when the rain came and the neon hummed, Julia would sometimes stand by the window and think of the damp brick wall, no longer a cold barrier, but a place where the town's stories met and were rewoven. There was more to come, struggles that money could not fix, old grudges that required hard conversations, and the work of ensuring that structures meant safety and not control. But the hardest admission of a past that hurt others had been faced, and in facing it, a community had chosen to insist on both accountability and the possibility of change. Julia understood, finally, that pain could be a teacher, not an excuse, not a clean redemption, a grammar for reckoning. In that understanding, she found a measure of peace that looked suspiciously like hope.